Welcome, everyone. I am Dr. Keela Watkins, Independent Sector's new president and CEO. This is our first Upswell pop-up of 2023 and my first pop-up in my new role here. And I am so happy that you have decided to join us today. As Independent Sector always does, I want to start by respectfully acknowledging that I'm joining you today from Washington, D.C., ancestral home of the Nacotchtank, Anacostan, and Piscataway peoples, who continue to live in this area and are working to reclaim their land and traditional practices. I'd also like to acknowledge that many of the buildings and places we inhabit in Washington, D.C. were built with the labor of enslaved people. So for our first timers, here's a little bit about Upswell and Independent Sector. Independent Sector created Upswell in 2018 to be a platform driven by the community of change makers that make up the nonprofits, foundations, academia, government, and other community-based organizations from around the country. In recent years, our charge has been clear: to come together to build community and work together to build a healthy and just nation. Our community includes an incredible set of member organizations that work alongside us to shape our strategies and drive policy and practice change. If you're not a member, please consider joining us. You can learn more about us at independentsector.org/membership. And now to today's Upswell pop-up, our first Upswell event of 2023, entitled Fill Your Cup, Changemakers Recharge. This pop-up is all about you and your self-care. Why, you may ask? Because you are the most important element of our success in achieving our mission to replace disparities in our nation with inclusive and equitable policies that will improve society at large and give everyone the opportunity to thrive. You also can register now for our next virtual pop-up planned on June 20th, which will focus on centering equity in systems change and how we can collaborate and mobilize through systems change, advocacy, movement building, bridging, and storytelling to create real and lasting change. And we can't be more excited about our first in-person Upswell Summit in 3 years. That's set for November 15th through the 17th in Dallas, Fort Worth. Online registration for the summit opens tomorrow. I'll be looking forward to meeting you in person there. You can register and find out more about the summit by going to independentsector.org/Upswell. I want to acknowledge and thank our sponsors who help make all of our Upswell programming possible, especially Walmart, Allstate Foundation, United Way of Metropolitan Dallas, and AT&T. Thank you. We deeply appreciate your support, as well as all those who help make Upswell possible. So here's what we have in store for you today. I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Cheryl Hall Russell, President and Chief Cultural Consultant of Black Women Wise Women. Many of you will remember Cheryl from facilitating our exchanges. Today, Cheryl will introduce our main stage discussion and speakers, in addition to guiding us through the exchange. After the main stage, Cheryl will help us transition to Channel B for our workshop conversation about prioritizing wellness and service to others. And we'll stay in Channel B for the exchange. Now, before Cheryl hits our virtual stage, I want to share some quick housekeeping and logistics. All lines are muted. There's a Q&A box and a chat box. Submit your questions to panelists in the Q&A box. Use the chat box if you're having technical issues, or to leave comments and engage with other participants. We'll email you the recording of today's pop-up. It also will be on independentsector.org/Upswell in a few days. And with that, Cheryl, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you so much, Akila. And thanks to all of you who've joined us for this main stage session, Care and Joy in Our Work Cultures. I have to say something on a personal note as we get going. As a longtime nonprofit CEO, Upswell actually became the place for me to go to have open conversations about things that sometimes we were talking about using our quiet voices. There were things that impacted us every day. We didn't want to admit that some of us were heading toward burnout or struggling for balance. So this makes my opportunity to facilitate this conversation and this panel today even more special. We're going to hear from three great presenters who are deeply knowledgeable about creating spaces that center well-being. So we will start to bring them in now, starting with the introduction of Karen K. Suarez, who is the President and Chief Officer of Equity in the Center. It centers its work on influencing social sector leaders to shift mindsets, practices, and systems to achieve race equity. In 2018, Equity in the Center published Awake to Woke to Work, Building a Race Equity Culture, one of my favorite titles of that year. It dealt with management and operation levers organizations use to center race equity and transform culture. Kay is a management consultant with over 20 years of experience who's led engagements to refine programs and scale impact for national nonprofits and philanthropies. She has coached executives and social entrepreneurs of color whose work focused on eliminating race-based equity. Welcome, Kay. Now for education to activism, Liz Dozier has spent her career working to eradicate systemic inequities that limit America's communities from thriving. Her ambition is born from her experience as a teacher and a principal in Chicago public schools. In 2016, Liz launched Chicago Beyond, which works to ensure all young people have the opportunity to live a free and full life. Since its inception, Chicago Beyond has invested more than $40 million to reduce barriers to equity. And those are in areas of education, youth safety, health, wellness, and beyond. And finally, Dr. Y. Falimi Dubois. Dr. Falimi is a holistic human development strategist, public speaker, educator, poet, and self-care ritualist. Love that title. She integrates meditation, sound healing, and Reiki practices into her own private well-being practice, Holistic Alchemy. She is passionate about centering the voices of Black women and curates intentional spaces for authentic dialogue, self-reflection, and community building, and specializes in community conversations with higher ed institutions, public school systems, and nonprofits. Welcome to you all. I have had a wonderful opportunity to speak to you individually, but I cannot wait for this audience to hear what you have to say. So just to get us going, I'm going to ask you to start off by telling us a little bit about your own personal journey toward the work that you're engaged in now. And Kay, I think I'm going to have you start.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to join you and these fabulous panelists today. So when I talk about the work that we do at Equity in the Center, I often say that the fact that I ended up here is part of my journey in understanding the privilege that I have within a system of white supremacy, and then making the intentional decision to figure out a way to play some role in dismantling that in society generally, but specifically within organizations. I think the paper that we published back in 2018 really resonated with folks, and Andrew Plumley, who helped to, or really was my partner in launching Equity in the Center, we would often say that we wish that we'd had this tool in previous roles. And so at the end of the day, I feel like I do this work for Black people, for other Black folks, for folks of color. And I hope that it helps to improve their lives in organizations in ways that I know are really critical to well-being and ultimately to health in the long term. And in terms of care and thinking about how we operationalize equity through care and focusing on well-being in organizations, I'm trying to help be part of building an organization that treats each of us as humans as inherently and equally valuable in practice, not just in theory. And so trying to lead and start from a place of abundance. And so what would that look like if we started with the belief in racial equity and the spirit of abundance, as opposed to just the way things have generally been done, and giving those of us who work in the nonprofit sector what we actually deserve, as opposed to what the system thinks we deserve, which is very little. Truth
in that, for sure. What I love about today is we're going to talk about this from the organizational side, which is, really a specialty of yours personally and at the community level. So Liz, let us know a little bit about your journey.
Yeah, so thank you. First, let me just say it's just an honor to be here with the three of you today. It is, and just particularly to be in this conversation around like care and joy and well-being. We just don't talk about it enough. It's obviously come into, I think, greater clarity and focus in this space over this past 3 years, but I still don't believe we talk about it enough. I just want to just thank you each for your work, and just it's a joy to be in conversation with you today. So I am, Liz Dozier, the founder and CEO of Chicago Beyond. And in essence, Chicago Beyond is a philanthropic organization, and it works to, along with, 19 other of my team members, we work to just ensure the freedom of young people in our communities. And by freedom in all aspects, of whether it's education or we think about well-being and healing. And we do that through just investing in both like hyper-local organizations, those that oftentimes are not on the philanthropic radar screen, that oftentimes get overlooked, particularly those that are led by people of color. So we invest in hyper-local organizations and also in big swaths of systems change work. But all of that we do is truly undergirded by and driven by this knowledge and belief and voices of community and community perspective. And that was really just born out of my own experience of being both a teacher and a principal, a high school principal in Chicago, where I turned around, along with my team, one of the lowest performing schools in the state of Illinois. When I got there, we had every single year, if you can believe this, we had 1,500 children in our building. We had about 300 arrests that happened inside of the school, and we had about a 40% graduation rate, if you can imagine that. And by the time I left, those arrests had went down to zero. We had over an 80% graduation rate. There were people coming from all over the world to learn the restorative practices and things that we were doing around healing and well-being. And so what I learned as principal of Finger High School was this importance of this hyper focus on exactly what we're going to talk about today, which is well-being, healing, humanness, and what are those practices that actually make the difference. And that's truly, when people look at that school and what turned it around, that's what it was. And that's really the foundation for Chicago Beyond. It's the foundation that we are essentially built on, as the DNA of what happened at that school. And so this shows up in our work at Chicago Beyond, whether it is, we're talking about internal practices, like what we do as, members of Chicago Beyond, and how we try to set an intentional culture of care, but it's also practically, how we show up with our partners, those who we invest in, whether it's through a healing stipend or other things I'm sure we'll talk about today, but just the intentionality around healing and well-being and care in the workplace is obviously critical and is born out of that. So that's a little bit about my journey.
Thank you so much. I was a little startled by some of the statistics, just trying to get my head around 300 kids being arrested inside of a school in a year, and how getting that down to zero changed the lives, the trajectories for so many. So thank you for that. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Falami, tell us a little bit about your personal journey toward the work that you're doing.
Yes, and I echo Liz's comments. I mean, it is really a pleasure to be here today and in the presence of having a much needed conversation about well-being and self-care. I can talk about this all day, every day. And it needs to be, right? To have this open dialogue, to have some healing conversation. So thank you. I am grateful to be here. So my journey to becoming the self-care ritualist really started with my own health issues. I had too many strokes at the age of 38. I then had some struggles with some other health conditions. And then I lived and loved someone with a mental health condition. And that forced me to take control of my self-care as I was supporting my partner at the time and making sure that they were okay, making sure that they were doing what they needed for their self-care and knowing what I needed to do for my self-care. And so just as many care providers find that they have to do something so that they can be of good service to whomever they're supporting. So that was where it started. And then my research around the lived experiences of Black women in their bodies. What came out of my research was more than what I anticipated. And a part of that was how the women really dig into their self-care and the ways in which what it looked like around their bodies. So all of that morphed into me having this platform to talk about my rituals and talking about self and collective care and the benefits of that, and working with an organization to create a wellness plan for the organization. And to try to dig into what I call this collective care community, and making sure that was happening. So all of that is how I got to this place. So yeah, I'm excited and I'm grateful.
Fantastic. So we use those terms. I mean, I've done research as well on Black women, and sometimes it's about the lack of self-care and, you know, how they're trying to discover it. So how are we really, Dr. Falami, how are you defining well-being and collective care? We use that term very loosely sometimes as if everybody knows what you're talking about. For you, how is that defined? How are those concepts defined?
And for me, when I talk about well-being, Cheryl, is that having a sense of groundedness, being grounded, being healthy, and underneath healthy is emotionally healthy, physically healthy, spiritually. I'm a holistic practitioner, so I will always come with the three: the mind, the body, and the spirit, and also the soul. So how are we being healthy, right? And then also part of this well-being is how are we thriving, right? How are we thriving? So that's what I talk about when I talk about well-being, because oftentimes folks saying, you know, I'm just surviving. We don't need to survive, y'all. We need to thrive. And what I talk about is how do we get to this optimal well-being? What does that look like for a person, right? And so that is when I'm talking about well-being, that's what I talk about. And in terms of collective care, and I always recognize that collective care, those of us who are familiar with the work of the Combahee River Collective, we understand that, and as well as the Black Panther movement, you know, they demonstrated what collective care is, right? And so this collective care is this shared notion of responsibility of the welfare and the well-being of a community, of a collective, of an organization, right? So how and everyone can contribute to this form of care. So that is when I talk about collective care. And so, you know, because self-care has been co-opted. Cheryl, it has. it has been capitalized.
Right.
And I want to be very clear in saying that, you know, when I put self and collective care together, because it's not just about the individual, because if I'm not well, we all aren't well, right? And so if we think about that, and so and going into organizations that have not transferred this knowledge into collective care of everyone, there's some work that has to be done. There's some work that has to be done.
Wow. And it's interesting that you stopped there, because I think during this pandemic, it made us really look at what collective care was. I think we were doing a show here in Pittsburgh about what Black Pittsburgh needs to know. And we were really focusing on how Black people were experiencing the pandemic, or, you know, and getting resources. And we saw all of these that had formerly been kind of underground systems of collective work really start to bubble up and protect people. And so, you know, because it really highlighted the gross inequities to healthcare and wellness, especially in these communities, in these more and more marginalized communities. So finally, Dr. Fleming, and the rest of you who want to join in on this, how do we ensure that when we talk about wellness, we do mean wellness for all? How are you guys ensuring that that for all piece goes in, self and for all?
I can talk a little bit about the benefits that we offer at Equity in the Center.
Okay.
So I agree. It's like if one person isn't well, you know, everyone's not well. So in thinking of Equity in the Center, you know, as a team, we spun out into an independent 501c3 in October of 2020. So we had the chance to create our benefits from scratch. And as I said, I was trying to come from a place of abundance and provide a set of benefits that we each deserved. And so I think what we've come up with is a set of benefits that I've never received at any other organization. And as I look back on conversations at those organizations, it's often because, well, folks don't really deserve those things. You know, why would you give healthcare and retirement benefits in a nonprofit context when basically everyone is supposed to be underpaid? So recently, one member of our team asked how our benefits package came to be, and like, did the board support it? If not, why? And our board was supportive of our benefits package, and they named that what we provide is just not done on principle. In organizations. So in terms of compensation, folks were paid at least in the 75th percentile after a market analysis based on their job description and where they live to set, you know, competitive compensation. We also have a wellness fund. So folks have access to a pot of money, about $1,500 that they can use for anything that they wish: photography, equipment, therapy, vacations, whatever it is that would contribute to your wellness. It's up to you to define that. Healthcare is covered by the organization, and a percentage of healthcare is covered for members of your family. We also have a fertility and gender affirming care benefit, which gives folks up to $10,000 per year toward a set of procedures that fall under sort of the fertility and gender affirming benefit to manage for the whole in our insurance plans when it comes to these issues. And that is an issue of equity. And we also have a 4-day work week. We didn't start out with one. But we moved to one in January of 2022. And that is just an affirmation of all the things that each of us has said about the duress we're under in society generally, living with structural racism, specifically as Black folks and people of color. And as a Black woman, I knew I had to create an organization that I could survive. And I agree with Dr. Falami, surviving is not the barometer, but I had to provide a set of benefits that would allow me to recover from the physical demands of the role. And there were times when Andrew and I, at the beginning of the work and doing the work of facilitating around equity in the center's Awake to Woke to Work research, taught us a lot about, so how do people experience this work inside of organizations, and what are the practices that folks need to cultivate? We learned a lot of this through conversation with leaders in organizations, but also in just holding space ourselves. Often at the end of a conversation, we would say things like, this is going to kill us. Mm-hmm. And the data, as Dr. Falami was referencing, is that it does over time. That's what weathering is. So I've tried to create an organization where we are not insulated from that weathering, but there is a buffer within the institution to provide you with the space to recover from the demands of life in America, and then of doing this particular work, which raises your heart rate and your cortisol levels. And I know it's taken a toll on me, it takes a toll on my colleagues. So I'm trying to create an environment where the whole team, given the type of work that we do, has a set of benefits that supports them in recovering from the literal work that they do. And then just how racism operates on our bodies and weathers them each day. And so in terms of operationalizing a race equity culture, I really feel strongly that our benefits are a reflection of that, because we're starting with the inherent value of folks, acknowledging the specific inequities that people of color, trans folks experience just in life. And then even when you have a good benefits package, you still are living in inequity. So how can we then put something in place to address that and mitigate that disparity? So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I would just add on to that. It's as I think about Chicago Beyond, I think it's such an important question that we're discussing. All of the things that Dr. Falami mentioned in terms of like the interconnectedness of mind, body, spirit, soul are obviously critical, and they show up in our personal lives, in the workplace. Similar to what Kay mentioned, Chicago Beyond has, everything from like a wellness stipend to like the healthcare benefits, very similar. And I would add the thing that we just started doing, and I would say this is probably during COVID, where it really came to light to us that in addition to those things, it's like, how are we creating a culture, like a celebratory culture around this notion of healing? And what does that actually look like in the workplace? Because what I felt I was doing, let's say pre-COVID as the leader, was like, I put all the things in place. I had, there was a list of, here's the healthcare plan, here's the wellness stipend, here's these things. But like, one, how much are people really taking advantage of it? And what was I saying by not like really lifting this up as something to be celebrated? So just give you just a small story. Yesterday in our Monday morning check-in meeting, one of my team members, we have unlimited PTO. And we know that the data shows that actually when you have unlimited PTO, actually people are less likely to take the basic PTO. And so I wanted the team to have the unlimited PTO, but I actually wanted them to use it, and to use it like as they saw fit for their own lives. And so what I started doing as the leader, but eventually the team really got on board is celebrating the simple things. So one of my team members came on the Monday morning meeting, and she, took a 10-day vacation with her family to Mexico. And she was talking about the healing aspects of what that meant. And we celebrated that, and we put things into place, and we talk about like what the benefits of these things are. And so really socializing this concept of care, so that it's not just this like checklist of things, but rather it is in the very DNA of how we are operating. And it was a subtle thing to do in many ways, but for us, but it was like such a huge thing, I think, in returns in terms of just the well-being and how people are able to operate. And then even with our partners, so those that we invest in, those organizations that we invest in, individuals we invest in, we had to really even take a look about how we were funding. And so yes to unrestricted funding, and yes to, lifting up community voice, and, honoring people's ideas and not trying to shape shift their ideas. And as, someone who was in the work in education for years, how are we providing them with additional resources? And so essentially with all of our grants that we give out, all of our investments, there's a healing stipend. And it's specifically for those leaders and for those people in the organization for their own healing and their own well-being that they get to choose. We don't tell them like, it is for this, but they get to choose. And so I think that, there's these nuances and the opportunities and ways in which we work that are very powerful.
So some of what you were saying was about culture change, and we're gonna get into that. But I think it's really important to note that the practices, the joy that you're finding in it, the supporting of that. Kay, you and I were talking about, even though you put some great things in place, people were just like a little wary about it. Like, can we really do this? Is this okay to do this? Because it's one thing to talk about self-care and hear about these are the things we really want. But when you put those things into place, sometimes folks aren't quite ready and don't trust the system.
Yeah, and don't trust that their leader is telling the truth sometimes. And I've heard this from other colleagues who have similarly put in place. We also have unlimited PTO. I've heard this from folks who have also shifted to a 4-day work week. We're all complicit in white supremacy and programmed within the system to perpetuate the system. So often when we are offered a liberatory practice, we don't know how to receive it. So when we made the transition from a 5 to a 4-day work week, we didn't have any sort of step down plan in place, which some organizations do over a period of a year. And in retrospect, I can see how over that year, perhaps I could have socialized folks to receive that I was saying what I meant, in that the institution is closed on Friday and no one is expected to work. So when we made the transition from December to January, folks expressed some concern about how will we do all of our work in 4 days? And so I said, we have to do less work. So here are the things that I'm not doing. Here are, for example, the things that you might start doing. Here are the things that would need essentially my approval to be discontinued. Let me know what those things are, and I'm happy to discontinue them. But then folks weren't comfortable being honest about the answer to the question that I asked. So we ended up with some conflict in the team. And over time, as we had some healing circle conversations, it came out that folks were stressed about, but not comfortable speaking to me directly about the fact that they believed that I expected them to work on Friday. And I have heard this from other colleagues. And what I heard is that they were responding to not what I had actually said, the words out of my mouth, not the fact that we were closed on Friday. They were responding to what they thought of me and what they thought I thought.
Wow.
And were extremely stressed about it. And I've heard this from other folks who have made a similar transition, but we are not used to being offered liberatory space to be cared for, and it is difficult to accept. It's hard to believe, and I see some nodding heads. So I
actually want to chime in on this. When you talk of this, is the liberation is so pivotal. And change it is a paradigm shift, right? And Liz, when you're talking about this celebratory culture of healing, I go into organizations and talk about that. It's not just checking off, did you call the EAP? We have a health and wellness newsletter. No, it goes beyond that. It's really making it holistic. Where it comes with the check-ins, the well-being check-ins, right? It comes with the 4-day week. It comes with, I'm actually working with a nonprofit organization right now where I'm working specifically one-on-one with their employees around self-care. So that when you talk about liberation, that's, that helps them take it a step further. Right. And so when we start to think differently about what does collective care look like? Mm-hmm. What does it look like? It looks like liberatory practices. It looks like walking, and I might be getting ahead, Cheryl, but I'm not
go ahead. We're flexible.
It looks like those walking meetings. It looks like, I can go on and on. but it is removing ourselves from the thought that we have to be productive for 70 to 80 hours a week, right? Caring, really caring, stopping to ask our colleague, not how you're doing, but how you're breathing, because the breath says so much. So, okay, I'm going to stop there.
No, I told you guys in the beginning, we'll skip some questions if something is coming out that's going to be this helpful. You know, some of the work that I do as an equity coach for leaders is to first talk about, you've got great plans. I love this DEI plan that you have here. What's your culture look like? I mean, what does it feel like inside of your place to actually do this? How are people really going to believe you if you're not demonstrating these practices, Dr. Palami, that you just talked about? They've got to feel and trust that you mean it, and they're looking at you. And so Liz, when you talk about celebrating that, that's where those culture changes. And what you talked about wasn't that hard to do. Sometimes we make this so difficult, and it just wasn't. But you also were involved in some systems change work, especially around this healing-centered framework with the Chicago Public Schools. So Liz, tell us about the co-creation of that framework and how you think it impacted the students that you worked with. She's muted. Yeah.
I'm muted. You know, you would think after 3 years on Zoom, I'd be able to unmute the thing, but you all know how that goes.
Year 5, it's culture change. Year 5.
Yes. So thank you for asking that question. So like, as you know, I mentioned, I was a teacher and a high school principal before before starting actually Chicago Beyond. And that was a big piece of the work, like I mentioned, was this idea of healing and well-being. And that's truly what transformed the school. And so when I had the opportunity to start Chicago Beyond, it was always like in the back of my mind of like, what is going to happen, or what is my role, or what role can Chicago Beyond play essentially in the lives of, really, we're talking about 300,000 plus students in Chicago public schools. And ultimately, we partnered with Chicago Public Schools. So Chicago Beyond, Chicago Public Schools partnered to create what we call the Healing Centered Framework. And it was really a full circle moment for me of taking a lot of the practices that I learned at Finger High School, taking voices of community members, of parents, of teachers, of things we learned at Chicago Beyond, and really building out a framework that asked, not essentially what we oftentimes do in school environments, actually in other environments too, not asking what's wrong with you, but really centering around this idea of like, what's happened to you. And it's just a fundamentally different way of approaching the work and this blueprint, this holistic healing framework. And it, again, centers not just on the young people, but it's the realization that, again, none of us exist in isolation. We are connected to adults and to, community. And so how do we think about everybody within that particular context? And so I'm really proud of it. It's the first of its kind in the country in terms of a blueprint. It's been picked up by other school districts, and people are implementing practices overall. So it feels good. There's a lot of work to obviously still be done. Yeah. Overall, I think it sets the stage for what we're talking about here, which is, again, going that layer deeper, focusing on true well-being for all who are in the ecosystem, not just a few.
Yeah, when you start talking about schools, that can be, talk about the place where big change is most resistant. That's amazing that you were able to do that. As I'm hearing you talk, you guys are talking about system changes, organizational changes, some of the things that you're instituting. I'm curious about, as change makers, my question is, how do change makers make time for themselves when we've got all this urgency, for the sense of urgency, we've got to get this completed? How do we tag out and refresh? We seem to understand big systems and how we should do it for others and organizationally. how are we doing it for ourselves?
Is that anybody?
It's anybody, it's everybody.
So what I talk about is, and I have a guided journal, the Self-Care Ritualist Journal. And in my journal, I talk about that self-care is intentional, and we have to be intentional about our self-care. Mm-hmm. And so what does that look like? We schedule every other appointment on our calendar. Where is our specific self-care that goes beyond the hair salon, the nail salon? So where do you include rest? Mm-hmm. Where do you include that? Where do you include meditation? So being very mindful and intentional about how you schedule your self-care so that it can happen, because the day will get away and you've forgotten to breathe, you've forgotten to move, and you have forgotten to do those things that bring you joy, that refresh, that nourish your mind, body, and spirit.
Yeah. How about you two? What does that look like? How do you tag out and refresh?
I also have learned that you have to schedule these things. And I think I'm a work in progress. I would not put myself forward as any blueprint for this, because we're constantly doing that dance, as you said, between urgency and then the need to provide space for ourselves to heal. But scheduling like massages and physical therapy and making sure that I get out of the house and walk for 30 to 45 minutes every day, buying a standing desk and making sure that I stand up at least once every hour, for about at least 10 minutes. I just got an Apple Watch because I need to track my steps and make sure, because I see a number of my colleagues closing their circles, and I'm like, I know I need this extra bit to keep me motivated. And also, because of the level of stress that I'm under, if my blood work is any indication, walking for 30 to 60 minutes every day is not sufficient to sort of combat the weathering process. And so I know I need to do better. And so trying to create like structures for myself and the way that we do in organizations that sort of force folks' hands. So forcing my own hand by scheduling things out. Liz.
Yeah, I'm not the best at this either, Kay. I'll tell you, I try. I'm not the best. I was sitting on Sunday. I kind of was trying to have like this relaxing weekend, and I told myself I was going to be still and not sort of, sometimes I'd piddle around the house or doing these little things, catching up on these whatever. And so for me, a big part of the thing when I think about like how do I make time for myself, it's being okay with being uncomfortable in the stillness of rest and sitting in that and not feeling or trying to noticing that I feel uncomfortable in it, but then not then jumping to do a thing to then so I don't feel uncomfortable, so I feel like productive. There is, similar to what Kay mentioned, there is this, we're just, and I'll say for myself, not used to creating that liberatory space, but I've been trying to lean into it. And so I think it is like all things for me, it is a practice. But I've had to like demand it of myself and just try to like keep in the back of my mind that, rest is a part of resistance. And like these acts are of and in themselves revolutionary, just in sitting in stillness. But then, I feel fortunate that I have like people around me, both friends and family and colleagues that will, give that nudge sometimes to like, okay, go do that thing or close that computer or just, do nothing and really affirming that. And that's been really supportive to me as I think about, what does it look like for myself and how do I actualize it?
Yeah, because I think we talk about it. I realized I was flunking meditation. I'd have, I'd have a 20-minute period, and at about minute 7, I was kind of jerking like this, like I'm sure I was supposed to be doing something else. And it was wild that I really had to teach myself about how to slow down because it was work and big projects and kids and aging parents and all this stuff and the phone, which was always telling me that I was failing at finishing something. And so, being that personal about and then teaching people how to treat you in this. Yes, indeed, I did take an hour and a half off today to do something for me, and being very non-apologetic about doing that. And I think especially with the people on this call, at Black women, I think for a long time we just took that pride of just helping others, and then we major blood pressure medications and everything else to try to fix what we've broken. Liz, since we're on to you, I want to talk a little bit more about your Holistic Healing Fund. It's a $10 million commitment to support Chicago communities. And so, tell me a little bit about the guiding values around this venture. Share with us how you hope it impacts Chicago communities.
Yeah, so we launched this a couple of years ago, and I'll say this. I think kind of the headline here, that the reason why we announced this publicly and we called it the Holistic Healing Fund is because we realized no matter if we were investing in education, or if we were investing in criminal justice reform, or we were investing in food security, or things around like health, like physical health or mental health, all of the through line of every single investment was around healing. It just was. And it was regardless of what our nonprofit partner was actually doing. There was this through line of healing. And as an organization, we just wanted to be explicit about that. And we wanted to call that into the space. And if, for all of us, who are in philanthropy, there's signals that philanthropic organizations send out into the world. And some are very, out there and shining lights, and some are more, I think, like covert. And we wanted to send a signal that was like the flashing lights, if you will, of like, here's what we believe. And here's, when you look at our investment portfolio, what you should be noticing, what we believe it's important for other people to also do in terms of investing in healing, and realize it's not like this monolithic thing. Because the reality is that, healing, as far as I see it, is oftentimes misunderstood. And, people think of healing and they think it's like this one specific instance, and that you have to zero in on, and then you're going to heal from that thing. But it's much more nuanced than that. And so, our Holistic Healing Fund is really driven by what we call like whole philanthropy. It's our like guiding ethos. It is our approach to our philanthropic work, which is to say, let's name this thing, let's acknowledge this thing, let's address it, let's like acknowledge like the many layers of like harm experienced by individuals, but in collective, let's just acknowledge, call it out, and call in something different. And also to recognize that there are so many different paths to healing. Mm-hmm. And whether it's like, what Dr. Valami mentioned around Reiki, or whether it is like yoga, or whether it is therapy, there's so many, or whether it's just like literally sitting in discomfort of being still, that very act of that can be healing. And so the acknowledgement of that, and I think that the undergirding of all of that is like, we're human beings and we have to like really function like that. I'll give a quick example of how that shows up how the Healing Fund shows up in our work. So we invested in an organization that I would say is non-traditional, and it is led by Donovan Price. And the total the crux of his organization is built on this of like, families oftentimes like, across the country, also in Chicago, experience the violent event of somebody being shot and killed in their family. Oftentimes they're happening in our communities, in our neighborhoods. And Donovan's whole organization, his dedication is to showing up with those family members in that moment, not, 2 days down the line, but literally in that moment. And, just literally praying with people, sitting with people, being in community with people during some of the most difficult times of their lives, and then figuring out what it is they actually need. Mm-hmm. Whether it's like, somebody's windows were shot out, there needs to be like a window repair, or whether it is like, how do I bury my loved one? Like this very sort of very real, but very like critical factors in like people like healing. And so, when I think about this holistic healing fund, what it is designed to do, it's really just this, again, this acknowledgement of how healing shows up in all different ways, and how as an organization are we, calling that out and then calling in a kind of a new way of looking at how we fund and how we support people in that.
Wow. Anybody want to comment on that? I mean, that was a lot. That's kind of amazing.
That was powerful to hear. And what was resonating for me is that how those folks in the community deserve what you're talking about. And I think one of the foundational beliefs that we have to unlearn, just like, folks who work for an organization deserve great benefits and a wellness fund and a healing stipend, is that communities of Black and Brown folks deserve ease and support and joy. And that's just a sort of a fundamental mindset shift that we as Black and Brown people also need to make, within the context of white supremacy. Those who are privileged within the system certainly need to address that implicit bias also. But I think a lot of my time in the nonprofit sector, the boundaries of what was possible was a deficit and a struggle mentality and a plantation system, really. And so we need to release that and sort of come from the place that Liz is talking about. Like, these folks deserve support and abundance through grief. And we as communities who have been labeled as vulnerable and have been literally oppressed over centuries, we simply within our society are not believed to deserve those things. And each of us carries that with us in our work. And we need to interrogate it in ourselves and in how we work with one another and support one another.
Hey, I think you raised such a valid point. I just want to, the word that you said, like abundance. And I think that's so, particularly as I think about like philanthropy and nonprofits and kind of how we're taught to do anything but be abundant. It's like, try to make do the most with the least. And one thing I'll say about, Donovan's work and the investment that we made in it, again, this is kind of goes back to those signals of what we're sending out of the space of like what we believe and how we believe people should, show up in this work, particularly those who sit in this philanthropic seat and have access to resources. Donovan was essentially doing this work like hand to mouth on like random donations from community people, which we oftentimes see in our communities where, we are supporting each other, $5 here, $25 there, somebody gives $75. That's how he was literally supporting this work. Keep in mind, this man was showing up at hundreds of homicides on a given year. And he was literally doing this on his own. And he's a pastor by trade. And we saw this, we met him, we learned more about what he was trying to do. And we invested $1 million in his organization and in him. And I think to Kay's point on abundance and to this collective conversation on healing, like, it is yes about like the practices, and it's also, as we sit in these philanthropic seats, how are we investing in people and in ideas in ways that are abundant, to Kay's point, in ways that are, I think, just by their very nature, proliferate healing like in spades. So, because typically an organization like that, a funder sees them and, oh, that's really nice. We're going to give $25,000. We're going to give $50,000. We give some pittance of something and we think we've done something when we know we have the capacity to give more and to do more. And particularly when it comes to Black and Brown leaders, we do anything but. And so I think there's healing and abundance, to Kay's point, abundance of resource as well as like other things. So don't get me on a tangent here. Okay.
We're not going to stop you. But yeah, because I was going to weigh in a little bit on that, because during COVID, we saw big systems being extraordinarily inefficient and kind of clunking around a little bit, trying to figure out how to help communities, when at the community level, people who had, like you said, gotten 20 cents were around here saving people's lives, where you're using their cars and packing, essential items in them. And again, got some small money to do it, because nobody else knew it at that time how to do it. But that longer term investment, the value of this was proven to the nth degree. When it got down to it, they were there and they were saving communities. And so that longer term investment is important. You also have Chicago Beyond's Rapid Response Fund that is really more centered around young people and communities. Can you kind of end on that, or we want to know a little bit more about how that's working well? Because these are all really good models. You're muted again.
Listen, 3 years, y'all. Okay, here we go. So the gist is that, rapid response, I believe, is just like one of our tools in our toolbox. Anybody can really do this. It really truly is a mindset. The goal of our Rapid Response Fund is to center on young people and center on communities and to get resources like just literally immediately out to people, whether or not you have, some proven track record. Like we're less interested in like what research is going to say is the right thing, but like what is community saying? And so I think one of the things that makes it different is that, we're hearing directly from community about who is in our communities doing the actual like work and listening to community voice as like a guide for where resources go. There's no application that, people have to fill out and type in all the great things they're doing or tell the best, worst story about the community, you know what I'm saying? But it really isn't, there's no application. It's taken on the word of communities. There's a quick delivery of funds. It is unrestricted. And, again, community members are nominating other people, other individuals, and to your point, Cheryl, there's been this, wide discussion around, policies and programs that were born out of the pandemic. Mm-hmm. We see that people can actually, and I'm specifically thinking about philanthropic organizations, they can move faster and they can do things in rapid fashion to address like longstanding harms and challenges that have existed for decades and longer. And I think that this, rapid response fun kind of way of doing things is, another example of that. And with that, I'll say that we also include that healing stipend. So when we do invest in, rapid response with an organization, we also include a healing stipend in that for those who are leading.
So that healing part, again, is coming up, and that self-care part. Dr. Falami, if people are hearing us talk about community care and, they want to be involved in it, what advice would you give about someone who wants to get started in that arena?
Well, first, I would highly recommend that folks start with their own self-care and work on that. And then the collective care is really about how are you, even going to the question and I asked earlier, when you are checking in with a friend or a colleague, stopping and being not, rushing out and saying, how are you breathing? How can I support you and your well-being? Those two questions alone, someone might say, I don't know, but that's okay. Mm-hmm. They know that you care, right? And they know that you are taking time. So that is a way in which folks can start this collective care by the questioning, by just slowing down. Because all too often in our communities, we are, asking a question, how you doing? Mm-hmm. And then you keep running, right? You keep on, oh, good. Okay, I'm fine. I'm great. Are you really? If you look into a person's eyes and just see and just stop, they'll say so much, right? So that is first is to start with one's own self-care.
Yes.
And then secondly is by asking questions such as, how are you breathing? And how can I support you in your well-being? And if they need some help, you might say, do you need for us to go for a walk together? Mm-hmm. Right? Maybe we can go to a dance class together, right? So give them some options if they're stuck, right? Whatever that is, what that person may need. So that is what I would recommend.
Yeah, it's interesting sometimes when you slow it down like that and you ask people, I've had people just start crying.
Yes. Oh, yes, absolutely.
And you see the welling and you're like, there's a lot going on there and nobody's asked and they're feeling a need to pretend. And I think even whole communities can feel that way when they've just been bombarded with a lot of stuff, just giving each other that opportunity. After during the pandemic, there were a lot of wellness practices and policies that were just, everybody was kind of advertising their new value systems and new things were happening. There was also some professed better understanding of systemic racism during that time because, the unrest started happening during that period too. What policies and practices are actually sticking? I know I'm hearing a little bit about how some of this is falling apart, especially around DEI, but around well-being, what practices and policies are you guys seeing that are actually sticking, that aren't being kind of discarded now that the pandemic is starting to abate?
In the social sector, I'd say that the remote work option is for sure sticking. I see a clear disparity between the stickiness in the social sector and the stickiness in the for-profit stakeholder value driven context. So that continues to make me happy. We all proved in the past 3 years that we actually don't need to be in person, unless we're surgeons or, people who are laying on hands or frontline workers. Like, we're not saving lives. And our work over time in support of the community absolutely works towards saving people's lives and liberation. But on the day-to-day basis, we're not resuscitating folks. And so we can be on Zoom, and that is hugely healing, as several studies showed during the pandemic, for Black and Brown folks and for women in male-dominated workspaces where they are covering and dealing with microaggressions. So I think remote work is a huge one that has sticked. In a couple of instances, I have seen organizations extend childcare or caregiver stipends, where actually they were, in the instances of which I'm aware, they were not tied to children. It could have been anyone for whom you care, another adult. And if you were a caregiver, you got a stipend of, in some cases, up to $2,000 per month. And that has, in a couple of organizations of which I'm aware, been extended, though not adopted as a permanent feature. But incidentally, that is a feature that would drive equity for folks who are caregivers, and I hope people will consider it. Generally, post 2020, there's been a fallback in the level of enthusiasm just for racial equity generally. But I'd say overall, people and organizations are still more committed to equity and justice than they were before the murder of George Floyd. Many people don't actually understand what the practice of equity and justice are beyond the words, but I definitely see in our work that there are more people who are trying, even as there is an absolute retrenchment and an explicit, we're tired of talking about race, what's next? It's been a couple of years and we'd like to move on. So both of those things are true.
Speaking of moving on, and I really wanted to jump in that. We need another half an hour, but they won't let me have it. But I want to end this on a hopeful note. So I'm going to give you each about a minute. As we work toward this healthy and just society and its possibility, what's giving you hope right now? Liz, what is giving you hope?
People, I think it really is the folks who are in our communities actually doing work around healing people. And again, all the facets and forms of that. Conversations like this, of where we're actually socializing, talking about what this looks like in practice. Those things I think are, when I sort of get like frustrated with the day, it doesn't take, much, but to look to, like, again, a conversation like this, or what's actually happening in this space, it gives me a lot of hope for where we are trending. And also I'll add to this, building off of Kay's point, is that this next generation coming up behind us, this generation Z. Like it is, yes, the pandemic that's promoted a lot of different things in the workspace, but this generation coming up at Z, they're not playing around. They want purpose. They want very specific things around healing and well-being, and sometimes, be a lot for those of us who are not from that generation, but they are forcing us to keep those key things that we're talking about in this conversation front and center, both in the workplace and in our lives. And so Generation Z gives me a lot of hope.
Yeah, I got a Zer in my house that's saying, I ain't doing it like you did it. I mean, I appreciate what you provided, but that didn't look like fun. Dr. Falami, what is bringing you hope?
First of all, these women on the call are just giving me hope and the organizations in which you lead, and just organizations in which I'm connected to that are committed to healing, and folks that are committed to healing and saying no and setting boundaries and saying, this is about my healing and my well-being. So I'm hopeful when I hear like, Dr. Falami, I said no. And I'm like, great. And then and also millennials and Gen Zers, the folks that are on TikTok and on the social media platforms that are talking about their healing, that are talking about self-care and what it looks like, and saying it's okay to do therapy. Yes, right? Yes. So that's what's giving me hope, because it's not something that they're not sharing. They're able to share this, right? So that's what's giving me hope. So yes, I can keep going, but when you said a minute, I'll stop.
All right, we got 26, they took your time, CK. So what do you want to add about your hope? We're not going to get you.
This conversation, and I say the increase in conversations, not just about healing, but liberation, and specifically collective liberation, which is tied to everything we've been talking about in terms of healing and humanity and the connectedness of our well-being. Ultimately, the goal is for us all to be free. And I think there are more explicit, intentional conversations about what that is and what it could look like in the future.
Well, elevating these conversations on a national level brings me joy and hope. And I want to thank all of you for bringing your talent, your time, your hearts to this conversation. Thank you, Karian. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Dr. Falami, for taking time to share your wisdom and your experiences. And I cannot tell you how many people you're affecting by doing that.